Welcome to Tales from 2070, the most ambitious history documentary on the internet. This opening chapter sets the stage for 170 years of human conflict, consequence, and ultimately survival. The archive begins now.
There is a question I've asked myself many times since I was old enough to ask questions. It is not a complicated question. It is, in fact, the simplest question a human being can ask. Why? Why did we keep doing it? Why, when we knew, and we did know, we always knew, we kept choosing the same roads, building the same machines, making the same mistakes with a slightly different flag, a slightly different name, a slightly different reason that always, in the end, sounded very much like the one before. This documentary is my attempt to answer that question, not because I am certain of the answer, but because the question is too important to leave unasked. My name is not important. What matters is when I'm speaking from and why. I'm speaking from the year 2070. I am speaking to you from a world that looks, in many ways, unrecognizably different from the one you know. Not because the future turned out better than expected, not because it turned out worse, but because the path between your present and my present was longer and harder and stranger than almost anyone in your time was willing to imagine. This record belongs to no one person. It belongs to whoever needs to remember. Think of what you are holding right now wherever you are. A phone, perhaps. A small glass and metal rectangle that contains more information than every library that existed before the 20th century combined. A device that connects you in real time to several billion other human beings. A tool that the greatest emperors of history could not have imagined, and that a child in your time uses to watch videos of cats. Now think about this. In the century before you were born, human beings with far less technology managed to kill somewhere between 100 and 200 million of each other in organized conflict alone. Not counting disease, not counting famine, not counting the quiet deaths that never made it into any database. The question is not whether humanity is capable of extraordinary things. It clearly is. The question is why that capacity was so consistently turned inward. Why the same species that built cathedrals and wrote symphonies and split the atom also built the industrialized machinery of genocide. Why the warning was always heard and almost never acted upon in time. This record covers 170 years of human history. It begins in 1900, when the world was, by its own estimation, the most advanced and interconnected it had ever been. When educated men in European capitals genuinely believed that war between great powers had become economically irrational, that the sheer complexity of international trade made large-scale conflict unthinkable, they were wrong. Within 14 years, the mechanisms they had built in the name of security triggered a war that killed 20 million people and left the survivors determined that it must never happen again. Well, it did. 21 years later. What you are about to hear is not a story of monsters. History rarely is. The most dangerous decisions in the record I am about to describe were not made by creatures who stood apart from humanity. They were made by committees, by bureaucrats, by elected representatives and generals and economists and scientists who had families, favorite books, and all the ordinary fears that come with being human. The machinery of catastrophe was operated, almost always, by ordinary people making individually rational choices that combined, at scale, into something irrational and irreversible. That is perhaps the most important thing this archive asks you to hold on to, through everything that follows. Not that humanity failed because of its monsters, but that it came closest to destroying itself when its most ordinary citizens stopped paying attention. What is fact, and what is speculation? I want to be precise about this because it matters. The first half of what you will hear, the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st, is based on documented, sourced, verifiable historical record. Every major claim has a source. Where historians disagree, I will tell you they disagree, and I will tell you why. Where the numbers are contested, I will give you the range. Where a government's version of events differs from independent accounts, I will note the difference. I was not alive for most of this history, but I grew up surrounded by people who were, and I have spent a great deal of my adult life studying what they left behind, the documents, the testimony, the archaeology of a century that left more records of itself than any that preceded it. From the 2030s forward, where the documented record thins and living memory begins, I will always tell you when the ground beneath the narrative shifts from verified history to extrapolation or fiction. The distinction is not a technicality. It is a form of respect. Why does this matter? Why, in 2070, am I sitting down to tell you the story of a century you already lived through? Because the most dangerous thing about patterns is that they are invisible when you are inside them. In 1913, the citizens of Europe could not see what was coming. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked information, but because the pattern they were living inside had its own internal logic and its own momentum and its own very powerful incentive for everyone involved to believe that this time was different. In 1938, the governments of Europe watched a man reoccupy a demilitarized zone, then absorb an entire country, then demand territory from a neighboring democracy, and told themselves, each time, that appeasement was the rational choice, that feeding the crocodile would satisfy it. In 2001, a superpower was attacked on its own soil for the first time in its history, and in its grief and its fury, it made choices that would cost 4 million lives over the next 2 decades, and ultimately strengthen the very conditions it set out to eliminate. None of these things happened because the people involved were stupid. They happened because the people involved were human, because the same cognitive equipment that allows us to build civilizations also has a set of very consistent failure modes. Failures of pattern recognition, failures of long-term thinking, failures of the institutional structures we build precisely to compensate for those failures. Structures that, over time, we systematically underfund, undermine, and abandon. I'm telling you this story because in 2070, I know how it ends. And knowing how it ends makes the middle, the part you are living in, look different, clearer, more urgent, and in some ways, more hopeful than you might expect. I should tell you something about the sources behind what you will hear. For the historical episodes, the World Wars, the Cold War, the crises of the early 21st century, every significant claim is drawn from documented, published, verifiable record. I will not read bibliographies on screen, but every episode has a sourced record and I will make it available. If you want to go further, and I hope you do, the documents exist. The archives are open. The evidence is waiting for anyone who wants to look. I am not asking you to take my word for anything. I am asking you to listen, to think, and then to verify. Especially the parts that surprise you, especially the parts that you find most uncomfortable. Those are the parts that matter most. What you're about to hear covers the full arc of 170 years, from the gaslit streets of 1900 to the world I'm speaking from now. It covers 2 world wars, a Cold War that was never cold for the countries where it was actually fought, and a 3rd global conflict that most people in your time did not believe would happen. It covers the birth and evolution of technologies that were supposed to free us, and that we instead turned repeatedly into instruments of control and conflict. It covers the slow warming of a planet that gave us every warning it could for 100 years before we finally and catastrophically understood the cost of not listening. It covers the extraordinary, terrible, occasionally magnificent story of 8 billion human beings trying to share a single planet with all the ingenuity, all the cruelty, all the generosity, and all the stunning, stubborn irrationality that implies. And it covers what came after. The reconstruction, the reckoning, the slow, painful and genuine turn towards something better that I've had the privilege of witnessing in my own lifetime. This is not a story of despair. I want to be clear about that. It is not a story about humanity being irredeemably broken. The lesson of 2070 is not that the species failed. The lesson of 2070 is that it almost failed, and that the distance between almost and actually is where everything that matters lives. What you're about to hear is the story of a species that had every reason to choose differently, and rarely did, until finally it did. This is Tales from 2070.